They saved my name for the end of the guest list. The only thing colder than the Minnesota air that morning was the look on my daughter's face when she saw me walking alone into the wedding hall. No hug, no warm welcome. Just a polite nod like I was someone's distant aunt who showed up without RSVPing. I had spent the entire night before ironing the deep burgundy dress. My husband always said, brought out my strength. I told myself today would be the day Kayla saw me again, not just as a mother, but as the woman who built her future. The woman who stayed through every fever, every parent-teacher meeting, every heartbreak she never knew I cried with her through. I had no idea that day everything I believed about my place in her life would quietly fall apart, and not with a bang, but with the sound of my name never being spoken. The wedding was set in a sleek event center outside Minneapolis. Glass walls, native flowers lining the aisle, and lighting warm enough to feel like summer. It was beautiful and strangely silent. When I arrived, I wasn't met by anyone from Kayla's side. It was Mason's cousin who greeted me and guided me to the back row. Not the parents' table, not anywhere close. I didn't even get one of those ribbons people wear when they're part of the family. I took my seat anyway, hands folded, dress smooth, heart bracing. I had rehearsed a small speech for the rehearsal dinner, one that honored both Kayla and her father. No one asked me to speak. The mic went from Mason's father to his sister, then to two of their college friends. It was as if I had never existed in Kayla's childhood, as if her entire journey to this altar had happened without me. What hurt most wasn't the lack of words. It was the stolen glances. People looked at me like they weren't sure why I was even there. And maybe Kayla wasn't sure either. At one point, Mason's mother passed behind me and patted my shoulder, not kindly, just lightly, the way someone might touch a stranger out of pity. I had baked Kayla's favorite pumpkin bread the night before, sliced and wrapped in wax paper, but the little basket sat untouched on the chair beside me all evening. No one noticed, and I never offered. I couldn't find the moment. That night, I watched Kayla dance with her new husband. They looked radiant, young, certain, and far away. When I finally stepped outside to call a ride home, the wind felt heavier than usual, like it knew something had changed. It wasn't just the cold air brushing past my coat, it was the kind of chill that slips under your skin and settles into the parts of you you thought had already hardened. Have you ever been at your own child's celebration and felt more invisible than the waitstaff clearing plates? Let me tell you, it doesn't sting. It settles, quiet and slow like dust on an empty chair. And that right there was when the real story began. The day after the wedding, I woke up still wearing the same earrings. I had carefully chosen small pearl ones, the kind Kayla used to tug at when she was a toddler in church. I kept them on, maybe out of habit, or maybe because taking them off would feel like admitting the day before had actually happened. Later that afternoon, I checked my phone again. Still no message from Kayla. No thank you, no follow-up. But there was a group photo posted online, Mason's family beaming, their friends framed perfectly, and Kayla standing in the center, like she belonged there. Her whole life. I searched the faces. I wasn't in the picture. I hadn't even known it was taken. That evening, a small envelope was slid through the mail slot of my apartment. No return address, but the handwriting was hers. Inside was a folded card and a dinner invitation. It read like something written by someone in public relations, polite, efficient, emotionally vacant. She and Mason wanted to take me out to dinner. They had something they wanted to share. I stared at the words for a long time, not a single mention of love or appreciation. Just an ask and a reservation. I went anyway. The restaurant was one of those upscale places that looked like a farmhouse but charged like a 5-star cruise. The host recognized them, treated them like regulars. Mason was already seated, holding a glass of sparkling water, like it meant something. Kayla stood when I approached, kissed my cheek lightly, then sat down without pulling out my chair. We ordered small plates. Locally sourced, fancy names I didn't recognize. I barely touched mine. Kayla did most of the talking. She started with a long speech about how the world was changing, how land should be used more efficiently, how she and Mason had a vision. She said they wanted to create a wellness retreat, a modern sanctuary, a place where nature met innovation. And then she brought out the folder. Inside was a proposal. Detailed charts, business plans, color-coded tabs. At the back, a signature page. My name printed neatly under the line. She smiled like she'd done me a favor. Said the property would be managed in my name, but only on paper. Said it would ease the paperwork in the long run. Mason nodded, his voice soft and rehearsed. He said this was about legacy. That Kayla and I could build something together, something lasting. But he didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the folder. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just sat there, listening to my daughter speak in polished sentences that didn't sound like her, watching her sell me something I never asked for. The waitress came by, refilled my glass. I looked at the ice floating in the water, cold, clear, slowly disappearing, just like everything else. The morning after that dinner, I folded the proposal back into its folder and tucked it under a stack of gardening catalogs I hadn't opened in months. I left the envelope from Kayla inside, untouched. My apartment was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the low creak of the baseboard heater coming to life. I sat at the kitchen table for a long while, sipping coffee that had gone cold before I remembered to drink it. There was no decision yet. I hadn't called Kayla. She hadn't followed up. But something had shifted. Not in the folder. In me. That afternoon I took a walk to clear my head, ended up passing by the old seed store I hadn't stepped into in years. They were selling packets out front again. It reminded me of the early years, before the arguments, before the silence, when Kayla used to run between rows of stacked feed, chasing kittens while her father moved hay. When she used to ask about the names of trees, and I had answers. I went home, sat on the edge of the bed, and pulled out the key I'd kept on my necklace chain. It was small and brass and cold to the touch. It used to open the lock to our family's storage shed, the one at the back of the property. My husband had always said it was a place for things that mattered. I hadn't been back to that shed since the funeral. I made the drive the next morning. The property was mostly untouched, quiet, full of dry grass and broken branches. The air smelled like sun on wood and distant smoke. I parked at the gate, walked the rest of the way in boots I thought I'd never wear again. The lock still worked. The shed groaned open like something exhaling after too long in the dark. Inside, it smelled of cedar and old paper. I had forgotten how many things we had saved over the years. Faded ribbons from county fairs, handwritten notes, tax folders. And then toward the back, under a canvas cover, I found the small metal file box, heavy, gray, still sealed tight. The key still fit inside. In addition to a few weathered photos and a plastic bag of old letters, there was a document sleeve marked in my husband's handwriting, not legalese, just simple block letters for Karen only. I opened it slowly. What I found was the deed, clear, legally sound, in my name. The entire 1,700-acre property had been transferred to me 5 years before he passed. No clauses, no liens, no co-owners. There was also a letter, just a few lines, written with a pen I recognized in the same steady print my husband used when he didn't want to be misunderstood. He wrote that he had seen the way Kayla looked at the land. Not with memory, but with calculation. He said he hoped Kayla would grow into the kind of person who asked before she took. But if she didn't, then this was my way out. My right to say no. I sat on the floor of that shed for what felt like hours. The wind rattled the roof gently. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just held the paper in my lap and breathed. It was the first time in a long time I remembered what it felt like to hold something that truly belonged to me. 2 days after I found the letter, I went back to the city. I didn't rush. I drove slower than usual, windows down, letting the cold air sting my face. I didn't play the radio. I needed to hear everything. Clearly. I had spent the night before sitting at the kitchen table, laying out every piece of paper from that box. The deed, the letter, the older tax returns. I even found a notarized statement from my husband's attorney confirming the transfer of property. Every document was dated, every one of them legal, no room for doubt, no space for interpretation. I gathered them into a plain manila folder and slid it into my bag. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a weapon. It was proof. That was all. And for the first time in years, I was starting to realize I needed that more than I needed approval. I made an appointment the next morning with Irene, the only person I knew who wouldn't ask questions I couldn't answer. She had been a lawyer for 3 decades, and a friend for 4. We met at her small office in the corner of an old building downtown. Still with the same bell on the door and a photo of her grandmother's orchard behind her desk. Irene read everything in silence, her brow furrowed, but she didn't interrupt. When she finished, she looked up at me and tapped the folder gently with her knuckles. Then she asked me one thing. What do you want to protect first, the land or yourself? I told her both. So we created the trust. It wasn't dramatic. No courtroom, no arguments, just a notary, a few legal clauses, and a protective layer that made it clear. Unless I was incapacitated, and 2 independent doctors confirmed it, no one could make decisions about that land but me. Irene added a few conditions of her own. She called them good habits. Automatic alerts, if anyone tried to record a deed or apply for a permit, a quiet lawyer in Duluth who would handle all correspondence, a clause that blocked Kayla or Mason from using my name in any business filings. The whole process took 3 days. I didn't tell Kayla. I didn't mention it in our family group chat. I didn't say a word to anyone. I just kept the folder. I still had it with me. When I got home, I placed it on the top shelf of my closet. Not hidden, not displayed, just where I could reach it if I needed to. The next time Kayla called, her voice was cheerful. She said she and Mason wanted to take me out again. She had some new renderings she wanted to show me. Said she thought I'd be excited. I told her I'd check my calendar. Then I hung up, walked to the closet, opened the door, and looked at the folder for a long time. I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel powerful either. I just felt ready. The restaurant was the same barn-style lighting, same overpriced wine list, same polished wood tables arranged like they were waiting for important people. I arrived on time. Kayla and Mason were already seated. They stood up when they saw me, smiling, as if we were just any family gathering for a casual Thursday night. Mason wore something pale and expensive. Kayla had on a new blazer, the kind she used to borrow from her father's closet in high school, but now it was tailored, modern, a size too tight, like she needed to look bigger than she was. They hugged me lightly, said it was good to see me. I nodded, sat down, and placed my napkin across my lap with the same precision I had used to fold her clothes for years. The menus were already closed on the table. Kayla leaned forward and said she had something exciting to show me. Out came a sleek portfolio, matte black with gold-embossed lettering. Mason gently slid it open and began flipping pages. The renderings were beautiful. Expansive pavilions with glass walls, meditation decks, elevated pathways winding through trees. Each page glowed with potential, with imagined serenity. They had named it Red Pine Ridge. Page after page of projected profits, visitor statistics, phased development. Mason spoke with confidence, his voice soft, his rhythm measured. He knew every number. Kayla chimed in occasionally with color, memories from her childhood that she wove into the narrative. It was polished, rehearsed, and not from me. They weren't showing me a dream, they were pitching a deal. When Mason reached the final page, there it was again, a signature line. My name already printed neatly below it. Kayla smiled, said everything was in motion. Just one piece left, just my blessing. I didn't say a word. Instead, I reached into my bag and took out a plain manila envelope. Nothing special, no branding. I placed it on the table and slid it toward them. Kayla looked confused. Mason kept his smile. Inside was a copy of the trust document, the clauses, the terms, the limitations. She read it page by page. No one spoke. Mason's expression shifted. First, the crease between his brows appeared. Then his lips stopped smiling. He turned to Kayla. But she was already staring at the final clause, the one about medical verification, the one that made it clear no one would ever control that land unless I was unconscious and no longer breathing. On my own. Kayla closed the folder. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't get angry. She simply placed both hands on the table, folded them, and exhaled through her nose. So that's that, she said quietly. Mason said nothing. I nodded once, gathered my napkin, and stood. I told them I was driving myself home. Outside, the air was colder than I remembered. The street was quiet. I walked to my car alone, started the engine, and let the silence wrap around me like a coat I had worn before. Only this time, it fit. The next morning, I made tea instead of coffee, something softer, quieter. I didn't turn on the news, didn't check the weather, didn't reach for my phone. I sat in the kitchen and listened to the kettle whistle until it stopped on its own. The night before was still settling in, not like a storm, but more like the ground. After it's been tilled, I had said very little. Kayla even less. But something in that silence had sealed it. By mid-afternoon, I finally checked my phone. One message, no name attached, but I knew the number. It said, "You made things more difficult than they needed to be." That was all. No anger, no apology, just disappointment wrapped in entitlement. A sentence that assumed my job was to make things easier for her. The kind of message that isn't meant to start a conversation, only to remind you of your place, beneath expectation. I put the phone down and left it on the counter. Later, I opened the hall closet. Inside was a box of old coats, scarves, a pair of leather gloves I hadn't worn in years. I reached behind them and pulled out a small set of keys tied together with a faded red ribbon. One of those keys belonged to the cabin. We hadn't used it in nearly a decade. Not since the last Thanksgiving before my husband's health turned. It sat on the far end of the property, tucked near the woods where the trees grew thicker and the sun dipped earlier. I remembered the creak of the porch boards, the soft scent of pine that hung in the air year-round. That cabin had once been full of laughter and burnt pies, of stories brewed late into the night and boots left muddy by the door. I drove out the next day. The road was rough, overgrown in places, but the cabin still stood. A little tired, but upright, like it had been waiting. I stepped inside. Dust floated in the light coming through the windows. The furniture was still there, worn but solid. I opened every drawer, every cabinet. Found a half-used notebook, a jar of dried lavender, an old flannel shirt folded neatly in a basket. The cabin didn't need much. A good cleaning, a few repairs, a coat of paint. It was nothing like the resort Kayla had drawn up, and that was exactly why it felt right. That afternoon, I rolled up my sleeves and started sweeping. The sound of the broom against the wooden floor echoed like footsteps in a quiet church. I worked slowly, steadily, until the sun dipped behind the tree line and the air turned cold again. I sat on the porch steps and watched the last light fade. There were no cars nearby, no messages waiting, just the steady rhythm of wind through leaves. I had said what I needed to say, not with words, but with choices, with actions. Kayla would go on. She would find another way. Or maybe she wouldn't. But for once, I wasn't building anything for anyone else. The land was still mine. And now, so was the peace that came with it. The following week passed slowly. I spent the mornings airing out the cabin and the afternoons walking the trails I used to know by heart. The air smelled like damp bark and the last bits of summer. Every step I took felt like I was retracing a version of myself I had almost forgotten. One evening, as I was washing out the chipped enamel mugs we used to drink cocoa from, my phone buzzed again. I had almost stopped carrying it. But that night, I had left it on the windowsill, just in case. It was Kayla. Her message was short. She said the bank had frozen a line of credit connected to a land appraisal. Said there was confusion. Said she hoped we could talk soon. I stared at the screen for a long time. The message wasn't warm. It wasn't cruel either. Just calculated. Like someone had lost a chess piece and couldn't figure out how. It read like strategy, not sentiment, a move, not a bridge. I didn't reply. The next day she left a voicemail. Her voice was calm, clipped, unusually careful. She talked around things, mentioned my health, my comfort, the long drive back into town. She never once asked how I was. She never once asked if I was okay out here alone. I deleted the message. That evening, I stood on the back porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The trees swayed gently. The wind had picked up just enough to carry sound from further away. But there was nothing. No birds, no tires on gravel. Just quiet. I thought about all the times I had made things easier. How often I had stepped aside. How often I had smiled when I should have spoken. How many conversations I had let die before they could bloom. This was different. This was me not stepping aside. I began writing again, not for anyone, just for myself. I filled 3 pages in an old composition book I found behind a stack of crossword puzzles. I wrote about the silence in my daughter's voice. I wrote about the trust that once felt unshakable now shattered into decisions and contracts. I wrote about what it felt like to stop waiting. The next morning, I folded those pages and tucked them inside the same envelope where I had once kept the deed. Not because I needed to prove anything, just because I wanted it recorded. Later that day, another message came in. Shorter. This time it simply read, "If this is really what you want, then I guess we're done here." I didn't reply to that one either. I walked to the edge of the clearing behind the cabin, watched the branches bend slightly, then return. I stood there until the sun dipped behind the ridge and the whole sky turned the color of burnt copper. There were no words left to say, not to her. Not anymore. I spent the next few mornings fixing things around the cabin. Nothing major. The railing on the porch needed tightening. The stovepipe was clogged with leaves. One of the windows whistled when the wind blew across the clearing. I handled each task without a plan, just moving from one corner to the next, like I was reacquainting myself with an old friend. There was peace in the work, not the kind that came from silence alone, but the kind that came from doing something useful with your hands. My fingers ached in the evenings, but I welcomed the pain. It reminded me I was still choosing this place, still choosing myself. The wild roses near the back fence had overgrown. I trimmed them carefully, remembering how my husband used to say they bloomed best when you cut them back without apology. It had been years since I'd handled shears. The thorns left scratches along my arms, small and bright, like the land's way of saying it remembered me too. One afternoon, I walked to the old greenhouse. The glass was still mostly intact. A few panels had slid out of place, but the frame held strong. Inside, the air was stale, and green moss clung to the corners of the wooden shelves. I pulled open the back vents and let the breeze in. That night, I lit the fireplace for the first time in a decade. The wood cracked loud the way it always had, and the room took on that scent of smoke and pine. I thought I'd forgotten. I sat on the floor with a mug of hot water and listened. No music, no phone. Just fire and wind and the quiet shift of night coming in. The next morning, I unpacked the last box I had brought with me. It held things I hadn't looked at in years: a small photo album, a folded tablecloth, a recipe card in my mother's handwriting. And beneath it all, a packet of wildflower seeds. Kayla had given them to me on a Mother's Day when she was 9. The paper was faded, but the seeds were still inside. I carried them to the edge of the clearing. The soil was dry but soft. I knelt down, pressed them into the earth with my bare hands, and covered them without a word. Later, I found a chair from the porch and set it in the middle of the yard. From there, I could see the whole cabin, the shed behind it, the garden, the path that led down to the creek. It wasn't a big view, but it was mine. I spent the rest of the afternoon in that chair, wrapped in a blanket, watching the light move slowly across the yard. Shadows lengthened. Birds came and went. I wasn't waiting for anyone. I wasn't expecting change. But something in me was unfolding quietly, like a door that had been stuck for years and finally gave way without a sound. It wasn't joy exactly, and it wasn't sorrow. It was something quieter, an acceptance that felt like breath after holding it too long. And I let it. It started with the woman from the library. Her name was Ruth, and she wore a denim jacket with the sleeves rolled up and carried a canvas tote full of gardening books and newspaper clippings. We had exchanged nods once or twice in town, but one morning she stopped me near the community board and asked if I had ever thought about joining a reading group. I said no, but I also didn't walk away. She handed me a flyer, printed in soft ink, a little crooked on the page. The group met twice a month. Nothing formal. No assigned books. Just a circle of women, most over 60, some widowed, some divorced, a few simply tired of being invisible. I showed up the next Thursday. We met in the back room of the town library, the one with folding chairs and a single tall window that overlooked the parking lot. There was coffee in a thermos. Someone brought gingerbread. Someone else brought copies of a poem she found in her wife's toolbox after she passed. The women didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. They just listened. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't tell the whole story. I just said I had a property. I had a daughter, and lately I had found a kind of quiet I didn't know I needed. Ruth nodded and passed me a slice of cake without saying anything. By the third meeting, I had started bringing things: a basket of herbs from the garden, an extra pair of gloves for a woman named Joyce, whose hands had grown too stiff for the cold, a lemon pie I hadn't baked in years. I had almost forgotten how much of myself could be shared without ever needing to explain. How a gesture, A small gift, a knowing nod, could say more than memory ever could. We never introduced ourselves with titles. No one said mother or wife or ex anything. We just were, women with histories too long to explain and no need to summarize. One afternoon after the group, Ruth walked me to my car. She asked if I had ever considered teaching a workshop. Something simple. How to grow basil on a windowsill. How to dry herbs for winter. How to cook with only 4 ingredients and a hot plate. I said I would think about it. That weekend, I cleaned out the side shed next to the cabin, hung some old pans, washed the secondhand kettle, cleared space on the shelf for jars. I didn't advertise. I just told Ruth, and Ruth told everyone else. The first morning, 3 women showed up. We made soup, talked about soil, sat on the porch afterward, wrapped in shawls and holding warm mugs. I didn't feel like a teacher. I felt like someone who had remembered how to belong. Later that evening, I stood in the doorway and watched the last of the daylight settle over the field. I thought about all the years I had spent waiting for someone to invite me in. This time, I had opened the door myself. And there were others who walked through it with me. It was late October when Kayla showed up at the cabin. No warning, no message, just the sound of tires crunching gravel and a car door closing too firmly. I had been in the shed rinsing out glass jars. When I heard it, I didn't hurry. I dried my hands on my apron, placed the jars back on the shelf, and walked out into the yard. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, same stance as always, hands in her pockets, jaw tight, eyes darting around like she was deciding what version of herself to bring forward. I didn't invite her in. She didn't ask. We stood there in silence for a few seconds before she spoke. She said things hadn't been easy lately. That the financing for the project had fallen through, that Mason was staying with his sister for now. She didn't offer details, and I didn't ask for any. She said she had made mistakes. Then she said something I hadn't expected. She said she blamed me, not for the trust or the land, but for how she had turned out. For making her believe that things would always be there for her. That love meant sacrifice without limits. That family meant protection, no matter the cost. I didn't respond right away. I looked at her, standing there, a grown woman still trying to make sense of the version of her life that didn't belong to her anymore. She looked tired, not just in her face, but in the way she carried her own name. I told her I had done what I could with what I had. I told her I had tried to protect her for too long, that maybe the real mistake was never showing her how to carry disappointment without turning it into blame. She didn't like that. She paced, spoke louder, said I was rewriting the past. I stood still. I said this land had always asked for honesty, that it remembered footprints, even the ones that ran away, that everything she wanted had once been hers for the taking, if only she had asked instead of assumed. Her shoulders dropped. She didn't argue after that. Instead, she looked around at the cabin, the shed, the garden that was half asleep for the season. She didn't say it, but I could feel it, the distance between what she had planned and what was real. She asked if I needed anything before winter. I said I was fine. She nodded once, then turned and walked back to her car. When the engine started, I didn't look away. I waited until the sound disappeared down the road, then stepped back inside. There was nothing triumphant in the moment, no closure tied in a neat bow, only stillness, and for the first time, that was enough. The first frost came early that year. I woke to find a thin layer of ice on the garden beds and a sharpness in the air that settled into my bones. Before I could get the kettle going, I moved slower that morning. Not because of age, but because the stillness felt earned. I pulled out the old composition book, the one I had been using to collect bits of thoughts, lists, half-formed reflections, and I tore out a page. I wrote my name at the top, not as a label, just as a reminder. And then I began writing the kind of letter I had never let myself write. I wrote to the version of me who had once believed that loving your child meant giving everything away. The woman who had swallowed silence over and over, thinking that peace was more valuable than truth. I told her she had done her best, but that she had deserved better. Not from Kayla, from herself. I told her it was not weakness to want to be seen, that self-respect was not pride, and that disappointment did not have to turn into shame. I reminded her that she had built a life, a real one, with her hands, her time, her persistence. That the land had not bloomed because it was generous, but because she had been. And that no matter how quiet the world had become around her, her worth had never depended on applause. There were no tears when I finished, no dramatic pause, just a small release in my chest, like air finally finding space it had been denied for too long. I folded the page and tucked it into the envelope where I had kept the deed. It sat there now beside old photos, letters from my husband, a dried petal from the first rose bush we planted together. Then I made tea, lit the fireplace, and sat down at the kitchen table with a kind of stillness that wasn't loneliness. It was something else, something steadier. That afternoon I opened the window to let in the wind. The trees had thinned, but a few stubborn leaves clung to their branches, golden and dry, shaking but not ready to fall. I understood that feeling, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't try to fix it. The morning light filtered through the windows just right. It caught the edges of the old wooden table, traced soft shadows across the floorboards, and made the steam from my mug curl upward like a ribbon. Outside, the frost was lifting, one patch of earth at a time. I stood barefoot on the porch, wrapped in my thick cardigan, watching the last of the leaves give in to the breeze. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet shift of seasons, a natural letting go. No one called that day, no one stopped by, and I didn't mind. There was no calendar on the wall anymore, no plans circled in ink. But I knew what day it was. It was the first full year since I had stopped asking for permission to exist. The wind carried the scent of pine and cold soil. I closed my eyes and listened. No voices, no noise, just the sound of birds in the distance and the slow exhale of a woman who had finally come home to herself. I wasn't waiting for anyone to say I was enough. I wasn't holding my breath for a reconciliation or an apology that might never come. I was standing on my own land, my own time, my own rhythm. The woman who had once been someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's last priority, now simply belonged to herself. And that was more than enough. If you've ever found yourself quietly fading into the background of your own life, I hope this story helped you feel seen. We all deserve to take up space. We all deserve to stand our ground. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect or even share your thoughts. Somewhere out there, someone might need your words the same way you needed this story.